Let me tell you a story about one of the most intense conflicts happening right now in South America. Just over the past week, violence has erupted in a region called Catatumbo, right on Colombia's border with Venezuela. This is a place where two of Colombia's biggest armed groups are fighting for control, the ELN and FARC dissidents. These groups have thousands of fighters, control vast territories, and are capable of launching attacks that can destabilize entire regions. This crisis led Colombia to deploy hundreds of elite troops to the area, and it's now threatening to unravel years of peace negotiations. This has been a massive escalation, one that's now spilling over into neighboring regions and countries. And to understand how we got here, we really have to understand what Catatumbo is, and what this region tells us about how Colombia's decades-long civil conflict is evolving in ways that could reshape South America. Let's start with Catatumbo itself. This is a mountainous region right here, pressed up against Venezuela's border. It's one of the most strategic areas in all of Colombia. Look at this terrain: dense jungle, rugged mountains, and hundreds of informal border crossings. This geography makes it perfect for armed groups and drug traffickers. But what makes it even more important is its location. Whoever controls Catatumbo controls one of the main drug trafficking routes into Venezuela and the Caribbean. In the 1960s, this region became a stronghold for Colombia's oldest guerrilla group, the ELN, or National Liberation Army. They set up bases here, recruited locals, and started controlling the coca fields that produce cocaine. For decades, they shared this territory with another group, the FARC, or Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. These two groups had an uneasy alliance, dividing up the territory and its illegal economies. But in 2016, something happened that would completely change this balance of power. The FARC signed a historic peace deal with the Colombian government. Most of their fighters laid down their weapons and joined civilian life, but not everyone agreed with peace. Some FARC commanders refused to disarm, especially here in Catatumbo. These fighters became known as the FARC dissidents, and they started fighting their former allies for control of the drug trade. Now let's fast forward to January 2025. The ELN and these FARC dissidents have been engaged in an increasingly bitter fight for Catatumbo. Both groups want complete control over the drug routes, the illegal mining operations, and the border crossings. And in the middle of all this are thousands of civilians, caught between two armed groups with huge arsenals and no hesitation to use them. On January 16th, the violence reached a breaking point. The FARC dissidents launched a major offensive against ELN positions across Catatumbo. The fighting was intense: automatic weapons, mortars, even some heavy artillery. Within days, at least 39 people were dead. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Among the dead were several former FARC fighters who had signed the peace deal and were trying to build new lives. Their deaths sent shockwaves through Colombia's peace process. Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, was in a particularly tough position. His government had been negotiating with the ELN, trying to get them to follow the FARC's path to peace. But these attacks forced him to suspend the peace talks. And that's when he made a decisive move, deploying 300 Special Forces troops to Catatumbo. These aren't just any soldiers. These are some of Colombia's most elite fighters, trained specifically for counterinsurgency operations in this kind of terrain. They're being supported by helicopter gunships and combat aircraft, showing just how serious the government is about regaining control. But here's where this conflict takes on an international dimension. Remember that border with Venezuela? Well, both the ELN and FARC dissidents have bases on the Venezuelan side. They cross back and forth using Venezuela as a safe haven when Colombian forces get too close. This has created tension between Colombia and Venezuela, with each country accusing the other of not doing enough to control these armed groups. The humanitarian situation is dire. The fighting has forced hundreds of families to flee their homes. The United Nations estimates that over 70 families have been displaced just in the past week. Local organizations report that more than 20 people have been kidnapped. Schools are closed, medical facilities are overwhelmed, and many communities are cut off from food and supplies. The impact goes beyond just Catatumbo. This conflict is threatening Colombia's entire peace process. If former FARC fighters keep getting killed, It could convince others who laid down their weapons that peace isn't worth it. It could push more of them to join the dissidents. And if the peace talks with the ELN completely collapse, Colombia could find itself sliding back into the kind of widespread violence it thought it had left behind. So, what happens next? The Colombian government is trying to thread a difficult needle. They need to show enough force to protect civilians and maintain order, but not so much that they completely derail the possibility of future peace talks. They're also trying to coordinate with Venezuela despite their strained relationship, because they know that controlling this border region requires cooperation from both sides. The deployment of these elite troops might help reduce the immediate violence. But the underlying issues, the drug trade, the poverty that drives recruitment into these groups, the weak state presence in border regions, these problems aren't going away anytime soon. And as long as these conditions persist, Catatumbo will remain what it's been for decades, a flashpoint that shows us how Colombia's conflict keeps evolving, finding new forms, and creating new challenges for those trying to build peace. This crisis in Catatumbo isn't just about two armed groups fighting for territory. It's about the immense challenge of turning peace agreements on paper into reality on the ground. It's about how illegal economies can sustain conflicts long after their original political causes fade away. And most importantly, it's about how the paths to war and peace in South America often run through places like this. Remote border regions where geography, politics, and economics combine to create conflicts that can destabilize entire countries. What we're seeing in Catatumbo right now might determine whether Colombia can build on its peace process, or whether it will slide back into widespread conflict. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the whole region is watching to see what happens next.